Welcome back to the Walter Bosley channel, where I welcome my guest, Dr. Joseph Farrell. Welcome, Joseph.
Hey Walter, how you doing?
Good, good, good. It's great to have you back. And I just, I'm almost done with reading every word of the
Rick.
book. And yeah, this is wow. The first one, both of them, just really.
Now you know why I had to write two.
Yeah.
I I got halfway through the first one. I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to do all of this in one book. So I started writing the second as I was writing the first one.
Well, I think that these are going to really prove to be much more important books to certain narratives,
Oh
certain
yeah,
things than people may realize, because, as they say, the devil's in the details on stuff. And this is definitely that
this is
kind of.
definitely a case of a lot of devils.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And these details, because as I was, reading this one and reading the first one, it's a lot of, hey, wait a minute,
Uh-huh.
what are the implications this is going to have on this, or what are the implications this is going to have on that? And
Right.
it's kind of those gap fillers
Yeah.
that really, when you get to the end of it, ultimately you look back on these books and go, oh, okay, that's kind of the I want to say smoking gun.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would be accurate, but it really is when you can put the people together. So naturally, from my perspective, the first one, and in this one in particular, it's looking like what you're showing here is possibly the both the financial and political connections to the hypothesis that the Airship Mystery may indeed have been a black project after the Civil War,
Oh,
or
absolutely.
very special black project within our
Yeah.
growing what would become the military industrial complex. And one of the things that jumped out at me is you have the way you put it, the phrase, oh gosh darn it, I had it, where the, oh, here we go. We discovered much of Wall Street and America's nascent military industrial complex in Montreal, apparently doing business with the Confederacy. That one really,
Yeah.
really jumped out at me. So, in relation to, let's go with the Airship Mystery narrative, where do you see this falling into play, or where do you see the Airship Mystery threads, possibilities in what you've written here in these Rialto in Richmond books?
Well, I think it's one of the central stories. Those books have a lot of central stories or central themes, and that's one of them. And the reason why, basically, I'm trying to flesh out your hypothesis that you advanced in your NIMSA book,
Mm-hmm.
um, where you're speculating that this airship mystery is really the beginning of the Black Project's world. And I think that's essentially correct for a number of reasons, one of which you also pointed out in that book was the statement of Timothy Busby regarding, I forget the name of the man that was doing airship research with the knowledge and approval of Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton.
Mm-hmm.
And the man remarks that, well, we can fund this research with greenbacks.
Mm-hmm.
And that really got me to thinking, because if you know anything about the Reconstruction period, and I should mention that the other reason one of the other central themes of the book is I'm looking at what the Trump administration is trying to do financially right now as Reconstruction 2.0. Okay.
Mm.
So I'm not in favor of what he's up to for reasons that we can get into if you wish. But regarding the airship mystery, one of the things that occurred to me was if you look at the financial acts of postbellum America, you have two fundamental problems. And the first is you have an enormous ballooning of the federal debt in the Union. And then you have an enormous ballooning of Confederate debt, which simply disappears from the discussion. So how do you make almost $1 billion go away? Well, if you look at the finance acts after the war, one of the key things that the Union did, it did two things. It demonetized silver in a very suspicious way. You're sitting right across the border from the Comstock lode, if I if I can put it bluntly. So you have this enormous silver lode that's discovered during the Civil War. So we know that the Union policy of deflation was very deliberate when you're demonetizing silver at the time that you've just discovered a silver vein worth about $250 million in the currency values of that day. So that's clue number one. Clue number two is the Resumption Act of 1875 under President Grant basically converted, and I hope people really pick up on this from the book, because it converts the Lincoln greenback into the same type of currency that the Confederacy used. This is key, because what it suggests, the Confederacy is financing its war effort by printing paper money and saying that the Confederacy will pay to the bearer on demand a certain amount of dollars after a certain period of time after the end of the war. Okay? So the Confederacy's financing is deficit financing. The greenback, on the other hand, the Union greenback, is a fiat currency that's debt free. It's like Kennedy's United States notes. There's a clue for you. But anyway, so the Resumption Act basically takes the Lincoln greenback and says, okay, we are going to resume gold payments for convertibility of these greenbacks, which was never the way the greenbacks were issued. As a result of this, the Union also passed laws to take a certain amount of greenbacks out of circulation, and there's your financing mechanism. Because what I suspect happened strongly is that, just like today, the Treasury of the United States will remove worn out bills from circulation. But you know as well as I do that the first thing that they use that money for is it gets shunted into the covert operations departments of the intelligence community, and they use that money slated for destruction to fund covert operations. And when they're done with that, then they destroy it. So I suspect that when Lincoln allows the Union to do research into these airships, that this funding continues after the war. Walter, I don't think Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, would for a moment have turned his back on continued funding of that research. Not for a moment. Right. Particularly given what I'm also outlining in those books is this grand scheme that some people have to unwind the war by having the Union and the Confederacy go after the French and British in North America. So, no, you've got a military reason for this research to continue. And then on top of all of this, the other thing that stands out clear as, the ugly French nose on my face is that the Union and the Confederacy both used observation balloons during the Civil War. We know this. They did this. Yeah. And the Union in particular, especially during the 1863 campaign that led up to that debacle at Chancellorsville. Thank you, Robert E. Lee. But the Union in particular was using observation balloons quite effectively. So we know that there was this effort to incorporate this technology in military operations. What is interesting is, to me anyway, the final icing on this airship mystery cake was you have Jefferson Davis and his continuity of government operation, and that's what it is, folks. The idea that we were trained, Walter, in school that Jefferson Davis was this fanatic, running around the Carolina. I mean, come on, Jefferson Davis is anything but a fanatic. I mean, he's just not. And we had this idea that, oh, he's going to continue the guerrilla war. No, what he was doing, if you read both books, is he was taking the entire archives of the Confederate government with him, along with all the official departmental state seals. This was a continuity of government operation. Sure. Yeah. And incidentally, he was taking along with him a bunch of species that simply is evaporated from the narrative. God knows where that is. And he was trying to make his way with General Lee and General Johnston into the Trans-Mississippi Department, that is to say, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma of the Confederacy, and have a rump confederacy and just keep the war going from there, which probably would have worked had he been able to make it. Mm-hmm. So what I find very interesting in relationship to the airship mystery is Texas is where it ends up.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's part of the airship mystery, because why do they choose Texas? Well, it has an infrastructure that can support that kind of research, but it's also decentralized. It's very difficult at that time in history to find all of these hidey holes and so on and so forth. It's perfect for that kind of covert research. Mm-hmm. So, I think when you add all of this together, there's a Confederate side to this airship mystery that no one has plumbed. You've got the possibility of a government. You've got the possibility of financing. You're next door to Mexico, where you can either invade it, carry out that plan, or you can not invade it and keep trading with Great Britain and Europe through neutral Mexico through all the porous Union blockade. So, it could have turned out to be a real mess. So that's the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, I had not considered a Confederate connection to the airship mystery, because I wasn't aware of this Trans-Mississippi Department.
Right.
Even its existence, until I read the first of the Rialto in Richmond books, and that was mind blowing. And of course, I immediately saw what you were saying. I'm like,
yeah,
oh wow, oh
yeah.
Is this is this where the money, the just the resources? Is this where the impetus? Were these guys Southerners? Were these guys Confederates?
Could be. We don't know. The interesting thing here is if I think there is a Confederate connection simply because of the way that President Davis had the Trans-Mississippi Department set up, because Davis appointed a Confederate lieutenant general by the name of Kirby Smith to administer that department of the Confederacy after the fall of Vicksburg. And Davis directed him to basically make that department of the Confederacy self-sufficient, which by and large it was. We have the idea that this was the backwater of the Civil War. It was not. It was self-sufficient in food production. It could produce its own arms in a very small amount. It could even produce heavy ordnance in a small amount and clothe its soldiers. So, it was basically self-sufficient. And the other thing that the Trans-Mississippi Department is, if you read carefully into it, it is almost financially, after the fall of Vicksburg, it's almost financially completely decoupled from the rest of the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And that provides opportunity for all sorts of funding and filling Davis's orders to General Kirby. You're to make that department militarily self-sufficient. We have no idea how much of that may have been covert activity on General Kirby's part. So there's a Confederate connection to the airship mystery, I think, that has not yet been plumbed. Let's look at the other side of the coin for a minute, the Union.
Mhm.
If you look at the Union officer corps, we tend to think of General Sheridan, Sherman, Grant, people like that. But if you go one tier below the top generalship in the Union Army, you're going to find a lot of names like Schimmelpfennig,
Yeah.
German generals that literally are Lincoln's red Republicans. I don't know how else to qualify them. They're literally Marxist socialist revolutionaries that after the failure of the 1848 revolution come to this country, and oh, by the way, the Union just happens to need a few good fighters and people that know they're military smart, so let's get all these Germans in here to help the Union Army.
Exactly.
So as this immense war is going on, what do we find? Well, we've got Baron von Richthofen scratching the desert sands in Nevada, exploring the Comstock lode. And Walter, when I ran into that, I just thought, you got to be kidding me. What's that family doing over here in the middle of this story? And for those of you who don't know, Baron von Richthofen in World War I was the Red Barons.
Yeah.
And then in 1863, who else do we have over here scratching around? We have Count von Zeppelin.
Yeah.
And I put that picture in the book and I didn't comment about it because, what the hell is he doing over here, Walter?
So you have
the airship guy.
You have an aviation legend, the Red Baron. I mean, these aviation guys, there they are in.
Yeah, there's something going on that has, Graf von Zeppelin alone, the guy that literally is beginning to experiment with dirigible technology that's going to lead to the Hindenburg and all of that early 20th century airship technology. And this is in the middle of the American war between the states, which is supposed to be this isolated thing having nothing to do with what's going on in Europe. And all of a sudden we have a member of the von Richthofen family and Count von Zeppelin, in the middle of a war that's taking place where we have airship technology being deployed by both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something going on here and it's off the books. And the thing that always disturbed me, reading Michael Busby's book on the airship mystery as you have, the thing that always frustrated me with the airship mystery is, other than that one mention of that one guy that Lincoln is sponsoring, there's no other mention of the finance mechanism for all this. Right. Where's all this money coming from?
Right.
Then we have the pièce de résistance, Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah.
Grant, whatever you say about his generalship, his two administrations have to be some of the most corrupt on record. Forget about Joe Biden, folks. I mean, he was a kindergarten teacher compared to Grant. Grant's two administrations, are studies in manipulation of financial policy to the betterment of a particular financial class, but the absolute ruination of the rest of the country. That's what so frightens me about the parallels now. But after his second administration, Walter, what does Grant do? He's made piles of money.
Right.
He's been gifted multi-acre estates in New Jersey. I mean, here, President Grant, have an estate,
Yeah.
It's off the charts. He goes on a world tour. He circumnavigates the world. And so while he's in Europe, guess who he stops off to see?
Yep.
Otto von Bismarck. So, and I'm thinking, okay, Ulysses S. Grant and Otto von Bismarck. I doubt very much, Walter, that these two men are going to be smoking cigars and having tea and discussing and sharing pictures of their grandchildren.
Right. You know,
This,
what you say about it, your comment about it, here's the thing. Remember the Reykjavik meeting between Gorbachev and
yeah,
Reagan. They're there
yes,
to discuss serious business, but
right.
also it seems to be an opportunity for Reagan to throw in, hey, if we're invaded by aliens, would you help us? So when this meeting between Grant and Bismarck, where maybe they discussed airship technology a little bit.
You
I
think
thought of the Reagan and Gorbachev. It's like, what was the meeting really about in Reagan?
about it, and we don't know.
Was it really about the alien discussion thing? And the other thing was just the pretense. Could be the same with Grant and Bismarck.
Well, I'll tell you why I think that that's a very probable scenario.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the funding for the Union during the war,
Mm-hmm.
unlike the Confederacy, believe it or not, which was able to obtain easy credit in the European financial markets, it was very difficult for the Union to do so precisely because of Lincoln's greenbacks. Okay. So the moment that the Union started financing the war by issuing a debt-free fiat currency, that's the moment that the credit markets of Europe shut down to Abraham Lincoln. There was, however, one country that was supporting Lincoln by buying Union bonds, and that
Yeah.
happened to be Prussia,
Yeah.
of all places. So, do I think that there's a financial connection to the airship mystery? Yes, by dint of the fact that if there's one foreign investor in the Union that's willing to buy Union bonds, and thus, in a roundabout way, to finance whatever airship technology Lincoln has Stanton investigating, that's where you would look. So, yes, I do suspect that when Grant is visiting von Bismarck, that the two of them are discussing financial matters,
Yeah.
to put it euphemistically.
Yeah. Yeah. In speaking of financiers, when you're talking in the reconstructed book,
Uh
second book of Rialto in Richmond, and you're talking about the New York City secession
huh.
idea and movement. What I
Yeah.
thought was, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I go to the airship mystery of the 1890s and this talk of the unnamed mysterious investor from New York.
Ding, ding,
Now I'm
ding.
thinking there's another reason to argue a post-war Confederate connection to the airship mystery, because if it was one of these secessionist New Yorkers,
Yeah.
so
You
we
have
might
to,
we
you
might
have
be
to,
even closer to identifying who the mystery New York
you-
investor was.
Walter, doff my hat. I'm so glad you glommed onto that because I was hoping that somebody would. Okay.
Yeah.
I had to write these books, folks, and hope that people are going to start connecting dots on their own because there's just so many to connect. All right. What the New York connection you're talking about is a group of New York financiers, newspaper, people like Horace Greeley, Thurlow Weed, who was Lincoln's one of his 1860 campaign managers, and then of course we have that whole nest of rabidly fanatical Republican abolitionists. I don't know how else to qualify them. Senator Wade from Ohio, Senator Chandler from Michigan, that ends up coincidentally being Ulysses S. Grant's Interior Secretary. So, got to manage all that silver and gold. But anyway, Thurlow Weed is at the center of a group of New Yorkers, along with Fernando Wood, the New York mayor at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And there's this whole nest of people in New York City that, for whatever reasons, all agree that Abraham Lincoln has to go. Okay. Which, of course, unfortunately, he did.
Mm-hmm.
But New York City was also, believe it or not, one of the places where the Confederate currency was minted and engraved. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
there's a connection for you. So, and the other thing that New York City was really pissed off with Lincoln about was all that cotton trade that New York City was able to conduct with the British is no longer there for them. So they're losing money and gobs of it
Yeah.
during the Civil
Yeah.
War. So there's this nest of financiers, newspapermen, radical Republicans, plus the New York City politicians themselves that all hate Lincoln. They agree this war is a bad idea. We've got to end it, and we've got to finance any means that we can to end it.
Hmm.
So, yeah, there's some sort of Confederate connection there. And again, given the fact that this New York circle includes people like Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, key figure folks. And therefore, when you say Stanton, General Benjamin Butler, one of his spy masters, his chief of Metropolitan Police in Washington at the time, a colonel by the name of Lafayette Baker. In other words, the entire Union intelligence network is plugged into that group of New Yorkers via Edwin Stanton. And by the way, while we're mentioning the New Yorkers, so is John Wilkes Booth.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Hey,
purely coincidence.
this General Butler you mentioned, was he
Yeah.
a relation to Smedley Butler, the Marine Corps commander of the 20th century?
Good question. I don't know.
Because
Good
here's
question.
why. We know that Smedley Butler, made waves when he publicly came out and said, "I've been serving essentially a military industrial empire.
Right.
This whole time."
Right.
And so I find it interesting the theme of his revelation with if there was some connection to this background of the very thing going on. Here's another
Hang on to that thought if you can, because let me mention the Smedley Butler connection for you.
Yes.
Remember that in his memoirs, General Butler mentioned that there was a cabal
Yeah.
that had approached him to launch a coup d'état against President Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And that cabal was based where?
Was it
New York City.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Wow.
There you go.
And it never ends. Well, another airship mystery. My hypothesis post Black Project connection here in what you talk about in the book. Now, we know that in my book on Ambrose Bierce, I propose that because of his connections to Treasury Department, Secret Service, that he was involved somehow on the security angle of this Black Project, and I lay out he was even possibly part of the expedition to locate sites where they would fly and test and house test airship. Here's the thing that jumped out of me in this book: the bit about the cotton. If you recall, before the war was over, when he got wounded, he was then released from Army duty and became a Treasury agent. And he specifically was assigned to investigate the contraband cotton that they believed was going to England. And so now I wonder, was it just that overt, he's a Treasury agent looking for that, or could he actually have already been working on behalf of the machinations?
I think it's very easy that he could have been working covertly for the machinations, as you're calling it, or to put it differently, the hidden funding mechanism for that airship technology. And the reason why I think that is I spent a good amount of time in the Rialto Reconstructed book talking about the contraband cotton trade that was conducted between the Union and Confederacy. And again, it doesn't get more bizarre than that, because President Lincoln, even as late as 1864, authorized a cotton for contraband deal, an under the table deal with the Confederacy for about $500 million worth of cotton. Now, why would President Lincoln do that? Well, number one, there's two sources of for clothing at that time in world history: wool and cotton.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to clothe the Union Army and Britain is not giving you any wool or cotton for trade, there's only one place you can go, and that's Jeff Davis. And he'll be happy to trade some cotton for some good old-fashioned Union rifles and cannon.
Absolutely.
So you've got this massive black market in cotton and arms taking place during the Civil War. And part of this funding, as all of this is being exchanged, there's two ways you can do the financial clearing. And this is where I think your friend Ambrose Bierce would come in. Because you can either clear it through issuance of bonds and bills of exchange, which can be traced.
Right. Okay.
Or the second method is you can issue the trade or clear the trade through Lincoln greenbacks and specie payments. And that is always going to be anonymous.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can literally on the basis of this black market already, with that said, you're dealing with cooked books. And once we get into the range of $500 million in the currency value at that time, that's a hefty chunk of money. And a lot of that is going to be completely off the books. There's not going to be bills of exchange. There's not going to be any issuance of bonds or anything that you can trace publicly. This is all going to be done through Lincoln greenbacks paid to the bearer on demand and specie payments. And I strongly suspect it's probably going to be in the form of specie, because that's what the Confederacy needs to conduct its international trade. So that nest of vipers of Union and Confederate spies up there in Montreal, they're going to be talking cotton for gold.
Okay. And could we safely say that it was the Civil War, our war between the states, in which our industrialists, the light went on for them, and for the first time they thought of, wow, just keep the war going and we'll all get rich?
Ding, ding, ding. Because if you look at it, Walter,
yeah,
the war between the states is, Napoleon starts this off with taking over revolutionary France. And we have to understand that what made France such a powerhouse in European politics and military affairs was that the revolutionary government of France, and then, of course, Bonaparte came along and streamlined it even more. The revolutionary government of France standardized throughout the entire country all arms production. So in other words, that's a wow. So in other words, all French muskets were made with interchangeable parts. Right. All French cannons were made according to a certain specified, regulated dictate from the central government. Okay, so France became an armed camp just like that. And that's one of the things that created this immense military machine for Napoleon to command. Now, add on top of that the process of industrialization that's well underway by the time of the American Civil War, and you have your first military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. This is particularly the case with the Union. I mean, it's obvious. Yeah. Now, on top of that, the other thing I think you have to look at the Union both during and after the war. There's a reason I wrote those two books together, picking up at the end of the war and then carrying it on into Reconstruction, because that should belong together. And the reason why I'm taking such a long way around Harvey's barn, Walter, is that you suggested, did they have the realization that they could make a lot of money if this military industrial
Right.
complex could continue the war? Answer, yes, because that's precisely what they did long after the last Confederate field armies had surrendered. And they did it in the guise of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kept the country deliberately divided
It
after
was
Reconstruction.
it was in fact you could say almost that Reconstruction was their resentment that the hostilities were brought to
Yes,
an end. It was like, oh,
yes,
really? We're not ready for this to end. By God, we're going to make our fortunes, and so fine,
exactly.
we'll make
Well, let me give
war
you
on you financially and socially.
the example that absolutely confirms that reading. Robert E. Lee, of course, we know the story, the iconic surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant. Okay. Now, I go into the background in both books of why that nearly failed. Because what Lee was trying to do was withdraw his army from Richmond and get it down into the Carolinas to link up with General Johnston
Mm-hmm.
and with President Davis, and then they'd all make their way to the Trans-Mississippi. That's what was going on.
Right.
Okay? When Lee surrenders to Grant, one prong of that whole continuity of government operation ends. Grant is able to negotiate that surrender on the basis of what he knew of Lincoln's post war desires and policy. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
When General Johnston attempted to negotiate a very similar set of surrender terms with General Sherman,
Mm-hmm.
which they did. And again, you have to remember why are those surrender terms important? Well, they're important because these Confederate field armies were, number one, particularly in Johnston's case, were not desirous of ending the war. The populations in those southern states still wanted to continue the war. It was that or, surrender.
Mm-hmm.
So the armies would not have surrendered if a harsh and severe Reconstruction policy had been part of the terms. That's the bottom line. So General Sherman essentially negotiates the same type of terms with General Johnston as General Grant negotiated with General Lee. When Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, heard about the terms that Sherman had negotiated with Johnston, being basically a repeat of what Grant did, Stanton immediately telegraphed General Sherman and said, the agreement is canceled. You are to resume hostilities with General Johnston immediately. you know? Which, imagine you're General Sherman.
Yeah, you've already negotiated this peace.
Yes.
And you've got this madman up in
Washington. In Washington, D.C., yes. Yeah, exactly. Imagine. So, yeah, Stanton wants the war to continue. Now, I happen to think that there are other reasons why he's really hoping that Sherman will resume hostilities with Johnston, because Stanton is trying to cover his own ass, quite literally, because of some documents that he fears are traveling with with President Davis.
Right.
So, it's a real mess, folks. Yeah, the raid and yeah, exactly, all of that.
What comes to mind when you talk about the Trans-Mississippi Department is I can't help, and we're talking about France and all that. Now I can't help but wonder what the whole Louisiana territory purchase and expedition mysteries and questions, what part of this that we're talking about could it have been leading up to, hinting at? I mean, whatever was going on there, we know was big enough that Meriwether Lewis had to be eliminated.
Yes.
And you had Nicholas Biddle, Central boy, in the middle of all that. So some of those players had to have been in the background of the financial cabal we're talking about in this book.
Ding, ding, ding.
You know, and I wonder too, to add on there, the American Bonapartists, what their role in all of this,
Okay,
their position.
I can't speak for my Confederate Bonapartist grandmother because she's no longer on the scenes. But yeah, she really was a Confederate Bonapartist. She named my dad after the Mexican emperor and then named his brother after Robert E. Lee. So when I say I had a Confederate Bonapartist grandmother, I really did. But anyway, I can tell you that there is a connection between the whole Louisiana Meriwether Lewis Nicholas Biddle thing and what's going on with the Confederacy. And it's again, it's as plain as the big ugly French nose on my face. It's Barings Bank.
Okay.
Because Barings Bank at that time was known as the world's sixth great power. It was a British bank and far more powerful than any Rothschild interest at that, believe it or not, at that time. And Barings Bank was the bank that underwrote the bonds that Napoleon circulated to help pay for the Louisiana Purchase issued against American payments from Jefferson. So the British, as they're at war with Napoleon, one of their big banks is underwriting Napoleon's bonds to fight. Yes, exactly. So Barings Bank is one of the major underwriters of the Confederate Erlanger cotton loan in 1863. So again, you have a British connection there. And on top of all of this, one of the things I went to great lengths in the first Rialto book to uncover was the Erlanger loan was a loan for about $20 million against Confederate cotton that the Confederate government took out with European banks. Okay, Barings being one of the underwriters, Erlanger in France being the other, Schrader in the Netherlands, if you want that Nazi connection, being yet another. The British subscribers to that cotton loan bond included the personal secretary to Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, the keeper of the Privy Council keeper of the Great Seal of Great Britain. In other words, the seal that has to be attached to all British legislation. Okay, kind of an important post. It also included the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had a substantial sum invested in the Erlanger loan, and that was, by the way, William Everett Gladstone. And Lord Russell. So in other words, basically the three big kingpins of the Palmerston government were purchasing these Confederate bonds and had investments in the Confederacy, and these bonds in turn underwritten by Barings. So in other words, is there a persistent pattern between what you're saying with the Louisiana Purchase and Meriwether Lewis and Nicholas Biddle? Are the same interests there in the Civil War? Absolutely. No two ways about it, folks. No two ways about it.
Makes sense. It makes sense. And what into my mind too was in my book on Sir Richard Francis Burton, his mysterious expedition to South America, I talk about his previous disappearance. He had two disappearances in which he never wrote the details, and these are the only two things he never wrote details on. One of them is the big South American thing, but the other one was the year before the Civil War, our war between the states broke out. He goes on this mystery number of days with, and I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, and a military associate of his, German guy. Okay?
Yep.
German name and everything. And they disappear in the South where
I remember that.
they went to meet who would become the Confederate leaders. I believe
Uh-huh.
it was Jefferson Davis himself they might have met with, but
Uh-huh.
his who would become his Secretary of Treasury or whatever. And
Oh, Meminger?
pardon?
Christopher Gustav Meminger, the Confederate Secretary of the Treasury. They met with him?
Him, yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's in my Burton book, but that's just it. We don't know exactly what they did and exactly what the people they talk about were talking about, what they talked about. We just know that he disappeared with this guy, and then that guy returned back to Europe, and Burton went on,
Right.
take his
Right.
trip across the plains and all that. So now I wonder what might his associate, his German associate, actually have been brokering with Jefferson Davis during those days that Burton was with him.
Oh, I can give you one guess right off the top of my mind very quickly.
Money or cotton?
Well, no, more than that. We tend to forget that Jefferson Davis had been the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce before the war between the states. So in other words, Davis was a reasonable, logical choice to lead the Confederacy during a war. And when he was Secretary of War, one of the things that Davis was, just like Lincoln, Davis was a railroad guy, and he was absolutely convinced that we had to have a transcontinental railroad. So Davis was actually in charge of a lot of the surveying of different routes, including obviously a southern route to across the country. But Davis in that capacity, again, we've got to get out of our minds the idea of a kooky Southern fanatic. He was not that at all.
Right.
One of the things I think that Davis and many of the Southern leaders at the time that your friend is traveling across the South and meeting with Southern leaders, one of the things that they're going to be talking with him and his German companion about is the possibility of the eventuality of a secession. And they're going to want to establish contacts and networks. And the reason I say that is probably the most obvious and plausible explanation is when the Southern states do secede. If you study that few weeks, they literally throw together a functioning government like that. In other words, this was not something that just happened.
Right.
They had been thinking about this for a long time. And when the eventuality occurred, they were ready to go. They threw together a provisional government. That provisional government, in turn, drafted a constitution in record speed. And it's interesting when you read the Confederate Constitution and compare it to the Philadelphia Constitution. It's very illuminating when you do that, because they'd obviously given some thought to existing problems. They threw together a government very quickly, and in the process of, during the provisional government stage, before Davis is elected the actual president, he becomes the provisional president during this period of forming of government. It's during that period that the Confederacy, with lightning speed, I would say, dispatches all sorts of commissioners to Europe. And in many cases, the governors of the southern states are not even waiting for the Confederate federal government to do that. They just go ahead and do it themselves. And of course, the first two places they dispatch these commissioners to are Great Britain and France. So I suspect that if your friends are meeting with Southern leaders, it's for the purpose, at least as far as the Southern leaders are concerned, it's for the purpose of establishing these network connections.
Okay.
And also, I would aver that, since you strongly imply in those books that these are intelligence assets, as well. I would suspect strongly that this is the other thing that they're interested in doing, is establishing those types of connections and networks.
Yeah. Well, now I love how just the strings emerge to pull. Now I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking, okay, I've wondered what the whole Louisiana territory purchase and expedition mystery, Meriwether Lewis, being murdered and Biddle and all
Mm-hmm.
that in the background. Now I wonder, because if I'm not mistaken, that what was going to be the Texas connection to what Aaron Burr was involved with. And I wonder if that played a role in the ultimate Trans-Mississippi department formation, because
Oh yeah,
what, again,
yeah.
Texas,
That could very well
we're
be.
gonna go to
At this juncture, Walter, I don't put anything out of view. I think that is a profound insight and worth following. There clearly is something going on about the whole Louisiana thing, particularly with Texas and the war with Mexico, and how President Polk, managed to euchre us into that one.
yeah.
Um, there's a lot we're not being told about all of this, and I'll be blunt. I suspect that a lot of this information was somehow in the Confederate archives,
Hmm.
and that this is the reason that Stanton was in such a rush to glom onto as much of those archives as he could. And by the way, folks, when Stanton gloms onto something, for the most part, it disappears forever from history. And there are a couple of examples in the book of things that were in the Confederate archives that Stanton glommed onto, and they've completely disappeared.
Yeah.
So I suspect that there's something going on there. Stanton has too many connections, and he's too much of a snake. I mean, it's very clear to me that he's involved in Lincoln's murder, and it's very clear to me that he's double dealing big time. He's prosecuting a war and promoting a severe Reconstruction policy at the same time as, prior to the end of the war, he's secretly trying to negotiate an end to it. So, I mean, the guy's a Martin Bormann. There's no other way to put it.
Well, when if there really was, and I'm convinced it's a very strong possibility. I don't want to say I'm convinced that there was. I'm basically at this point in time convinced that there was, but uh, if they were pursuing this airship technology and they did achieve what was described in the 1890s,
Uh huh.
um, it makes you wonder what that led to. What you know at that point that we stopped hearing about people seeing these things, and it really comes to a culmination with the 1903 Tesla story, where
Ah.
the legend about a group came to him and said, design us one of your airships that we can take, as nutty as it sounds, in 1903, that we can take to Mars. And whether they got to Mars or not, if they're thinking about even shooting stuff off the planet, at one point did the others introduce themselves more
Okay.
overtly to say that group? You have to wonder, considering then what followed with the 20th century in that regard.
I can tell you at least one thing
Mm-hmm.
that has not been mentioned in connection with the airship mystery, that is quite palpably there,
Mm-hmm.
that no one ever ties to the airship mystery. And what it is the history of physics beginning at approximately that period of time.
Heaviside.
Heaviside, Michelson-Morley experiment,
Yeah.
Georges Sagnac, And the big whopper doozy, the Lorentz transforms, which Einstein gloms onto to enshrine in special relativity, at the same time that you have a very different view of physics being put forward by the English physicist E.T. Whittaker. Okay? Uh, to me, Walter, what physics did, let's go back to the standard narrative. The standard narrative has it that J.P. Morgan objected to Tesla's experiments because he couldn't meter the wireless broadcast system and make money off of it. Now, folks, if you believe that whopper doozy, there's nothing. I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Okay. No, Morgan stood to make piles of money from any licensing and royalty arrangements that he would have had with Tesla. So why does Morgan pull the plug on the technology? For a very simple reason. The technology is easy to make, easy to produce, and no one can keep track of it. And Tesla's already gone and done us the favor of publishing all these articles in the New York Times about how easy it is to weaponize this stuff. We don't want that.
Of course not.
So what we're going to do is we're going to invent some physics accounting tricks to convince people that the way forward is not through this path. And that, incidentally, is where many people suspect that the Lorentz transforms from the Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz come in. Is that he invents these things as accounting tricks to explain the poor results of the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was designed to prove the existence of the ether, and everybody knows, quote unquote, knows the result of the experiment was the ether was disproven. No, the ether was not disproven.
Right.
What was disproven was a version of the ether that was not set up properly to measure the interference. That's where Sagnac comes in. But by the time Michelson-Morley and Lorentz are glommed onto by Albert Einstein, we now have set physics down. I'm going to be very blunt here, folks. The relativity dead end. So that now, what's the big problem in theoretical physics? How do we get general relativity and quantum mechanics to go together?
Yeah.
And they can't do it. And there's reasons that they can't. So, yeah, physics took a turn right about the time of the full force of the Airship Mystery in the late 1890s being done. It's at the same time that the Michelson-Morley experiment is performed, and it's at the same time period that Tesla is doing his Colorado experiments. So in other words, you were dealing with technologies in one shape or fashion, the airships, Tesla, and so on, that in one shape or fashion was pursuing this whole concept of ether-based physics. Even Maxwell. Even Heaviside's secret version of Maxwell that he kept out of everybody's prying eyes. Okay. Then we have the public version that we have been saddled with ever since.
Yeah.
Ben Rich, we found an error in the equations. Now we can take ET home. Okay, Ben. Where might that home be while you're at it?
Yeah. Well, we're not going to tell you.
We're not going to tell you.
And then, and of course, the natural heir of what you're talking about, who gets a lid clamped down on his work, Townsend Brown.
Yeah.
There's
absolutely.
Between the era you're talking about, and today is T. Townsend Brown. And let's not forget, that's a whole other show that we should do sometime. Let's not forget this mysterious family, the Wilsons.
Oh yeah.
It's that's a whole other thing, but it just it shows that it's been suppressed. So we're getting low on time here. So one more thing I wanted to ask you about, since I mentioned the bridge, T. Townsend Brown, what kind of parallels to what you talk about in Rialto in Richmond books 1 and 2 and all this stuff we're talking about? What kind of parallels do you see to what's going on today, right now?
Oh, huge. One of the reasons that one of the major reasons that I wrote the two books and was in a rush to get the second one out in particular was what I see the financial moves going on with the Trump administration are. And I have to be very blunt and honest. I am absolutely dead set against what I see happening.
Mm.
And it's not that I'm not a fan of some of the things that Mr. Trump has done and is doing, but his financial plans, no. His financial plans are Reconstruction 2.0. And let me tell you why.
Mm-hmm.
What he's doing with his sovereign wealth fund in particular is the Reconstruction 2.0 version of things, because he's establishing a sovereign wealth fund that is monetizing federal assets. Please note what I just said.
Okay.
That concerns all of you people out there in the western part of the country, because most of that land is federal.
Yeah.
All right. He's monetizing federal assets. And then the other part of his sovereign wealth fund is, guess what? Cryptocurrency. Now, I'm totally 150% four square with Catherine Austin Fitz here. We do not want and should not desire a digital cashless society, because that is the Chinese social credit system. It's converting your money into a corporate coupon that they can adjust the value of at the push of a button on the computer. If you're good little boys, you get more value for your coupon, and if you're bad little boys and girls, you get less, or maybe not even be able to spend any money at all. Okay, that's what they want. Now, in a sovereign wealth fund, what that means is we get electronic blips in return for hard assets of the federal government. That's what it means. And I'm sorry, I want cold, hard cash, be it gold, silver, assets, commodities, or little notes that tell me that this is redeemable for X amount of, that's what I want. I do not want electronic blips on a computer screen. We've just seen how well that worked out in Iran, because Israel wiped out millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency on Iranian accounts by hacking into them. And by the way, let's remember they told us 10 years ago that cryptocurrencies were completely safe and totally unhackable.
Right.
So yeah, I'm against this. I'm against what I see happening. By the way, the other thing that they're trying to sell the public in this country on is gold-backed state bullion depositories, where you will have gold backing for that electronic transfer system. Now, why are they doing that? It's because I have a blog coming up this week, Walter, about this very thing. So watch for the blogs. But in essence, it's because if you were to go to a gold standard, the same thing is going to happen as happened after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, the American government had a cost of government of about $80 million. That was it for the whole thing. Okay. At the end of the Civil War, the Union debt had ballooned 1,600% to $1.3 billion. That's just the Union. Wow. It does not include the Confederacy's $990 million. So close to $2.2 billion for both sections of the country in 4 years. Okay. It's enormous. Now, imagine then you've got all of that circulating paper. And then you're going to, after the war, say, oh, we're going to resume specie payments and convertibility of the money to gold. Well, there's not enough gold to cover all of that. So you can do one of two things.
Uh-oh.
You can either revalue the currency to minute fractions,
forbidden thing.
right, to minute fractions of gold, or you can take the circulating currency that is redeemable against it out of circulation and deflate. What's going on now is they're choosing the inflation route because an electronic digital system will be able to readily calculate the minute quantities of gold supposedly backing your now worthless federal dollars. And therefore, we need that electronic system to be able to do that on the spot for you. That's the scam. That's what they're up to. So I'm sorry, Mr. Trump. No, I don't want your surveillance system. I don't want your Palantir that you're giving to Peter Thiel. I don't want your quote sovereign wealth fund. And by the way, notice the Trump family just got involved in cryptocurrency. Gee, go figure. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking insider trading on a scale that dwarfs anything that Nancy Pelosi ever did.
Yeah. Well, lest anyone think that we're off on a tangent here, off topic, talking about what Mr. Trump is doing now. Let's not forget that going back to the
You cut out. Uh-oh. Walter, I just lost you.
Tesla's papers for anything of value. Trump has a history of connection to the very things and people we've been talking about
yes.
in our books and
yes
and on the show. So it's always interesting to look to see what that might reflect these things we've been talking about. So
yeah.
and we'll keep doing that. We'll keep looking at it. Well, Joseph, we're at the end of our time, and
thanks for having me back, Walter.
Sure, thanks for being here. They're gonna love this one, I think. And folks, if you haven't read them yet, this is the second one, the Rialto In Richmond Reconstructed. You got to read these two books. They are amazing. They're going to blow your mind. And I've got to have you back on because there's so much more in this one and in the first one, some of the details to get into.
Yeah, we didn't even get to the raid. We didn't even get to the raid or the spy.
Yeah, the Dahlgren raid or Dunham and all that. So we're gonna do this again. So definitely. So where can folks find you at, Joseph?
www.giza, Giza, Death Star, that's all one word, lowercase, www.gizadeathstar.com. They can get the books there or just write the publisher directly and get it directly from the publisher.
There you go. Well, thanks again, Joseph. And we will do this again soon.
All right. Thanks, Walter. Bye-bye.
Okay, folks. I'll see you next time. Remember, go to walterbosley.com for my books and all that stuff. So see you later.